Ever since Armored Core 2, FromSoftware have seemingly not known what direction to take the franchise in. They had this perfect formula going for a while, with an equal emphasis on the story campaign and the arena. Then, with Another Age, they abandoned that to make a 100 mission expansion, completely foregoing the arena. Then, with Armored Core 3, they went back to having an equal emphasis on both components, only to then undo that with Silent Line, keeping the arena in the game this time, but placing a much heavier emphasis on the campaign. So when making their newest entry, Armored Core Nexus, how did they decide to structure the game, and how did it work out? Well, let's talk about it. And before I get too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 8th in a series of videos where I'm playing every Armored Core game for the first time and reviewing them as I go along. While it's not necessary to have seen the previous videos, you'll be missing a lot of context about my personal journey with the series if you haven't seen them, so I'll have the full playlist linked in the description below for those of you that want to go check those out first. But with that out of the way, Armored Core Nexus is a third-person mech shooter developed by FromSoftware and released in 2004 for the PlayStation 2. And rather than being an expansion for Armored Core 3 like Silent Line was, Nexus is actually a full-fledged sequel. And while this game is technically part of the third generation of Armored Core, it's also kind of not. While it does carry over a lot of assets and parts from the Gen 3 games, it also completely changes the core gameplay of these games, meaning it's kind of in a camp of its own within the third generation. So for the sake of these videos, I will be referring to this game and the rest of its group as Generation 3.5 going forward. And that also means that when I mention Gen 3 going forward, I am specifically talking about Armored Core 3 and Silent Line, without this and the rest of Gen 3.5 included. And there's something we need to talk about right away when it comes to Armored Core Nexus: the controls. And I am so glad to finally say they changed. They finally moved over to dual analog controls, allowing for easier aiming and freeing up the triggers and bumpers of the controller to be used for more intuitive actions like firing your weapons, boosting, and changing your weapons. And what's amazing about this change in controls is that not only does it feel more intuitive and natural to literally anyone who has played a video game post 2001, but it also does so without completely changing the feel of the core of the game or even how footage of the game being played looks. I mean, seriously, look at this and then look at footage of me playing like Silent Line, and do you see any sort of major difference? Because to me, it looks pretty much the same. Normally, I'm all about playing these games in a way that is faithful to the original release, but as you guys probably know by now, I will make slight adjustments or concessions based on whether or not it will make the video more pleasant to watch, and this game is horrifically blurry. I don't know what the hell happened here, but FromSoftware decided to put this giant blur filter over the entire game, including the HUD. They blurred the damn HUD.
What is that? What the fuck is that?
This just looks so damn bad that I went out and found a community patch that removes the blur effect just to do you guys and especially your eyes a favor, so you're welcome. And when starting the game, I immediately felt how much slower Nexus plays compared to the previous games. I can't tell if it's actually something they changed or if it's just because of the new controls, but I definitely felt like the gameplay was significantly slower than the previous entries. And early on, I figured this was just because I was in the early game and needed some better parts, but no, this game is just a lot slower, even with good parts. But after the first mission, I'm greeted with the game's new menus and UI for the first time, and oh boy. So the way that the menu UI works now is that there's a big map of the game world that takes up the whole screen, and there are little tabs on the sides that give buttons to access all the important menus. And this might not seem like a problem, but it kind of is. See, it wouldn't be a problem if the main thing that you did in the menu of an Armored Core game was just select a mission and go, but that's just not how the menus in these games work. You'll constantly be going to the garage to tweak or upgrade your build, save your game, maybe check your arena ranking, just various things that you'll do after almost every mission. And it should go without saying, but when it comes to designing a UI, you want the menus the player will engage with the most to be the most convenient and smooth to navigate. But here, they've made anything outside of just selecting your mission less convenient, and the menus aren't smooth at all. Weirdly, the menus in this game are capped at 30 FPS, which makes no sense because even being played on original hardware, the gameplay portions are capped at 60, and moving the cursor around on the world map especially just feels really weirdly choppy, and especially navigating through the garage and the part shop, I could just feel it the entire time. I don't know why they capped the frame rate in the menu, but they definitely did. And while we're talking about the new UI, it's important that we get the general structure of the game out of the way. When you're in the main menu, missions will appear around the map, and you can select whichever one you want to do from here. The weird thing about this game, though, is that time progresses every time you go out on a mission, so other missions will become unavailable after certain amounts of time if you don't do them soon enough. And even if you were to go through the entire game without failing a single mission, it would be impossible to complete all of them in a single front-to-back playthrough. And after you complete missions, there's a menu on the left-hand side where you can read news bulletins, and this adds a lot to the world building of Nexus and allows you to see how the contracts that you take affect the corporate conflict and the world around you. I thought that this and the mission structure would lead to a really interesting campaign and possibly have multiple story routes that the player can go down depending on what corporations are able to maintain power, but that's just not the case. The fact of the matter is, you will complete, fail, and entirely miss out on certain missions, but these won't actually impact the way the story plays out. There's one set route the story will move down regardless of your actions, and there's only one ending. Which means that the only change the system brings in practically is that participating in certain missions will lock you out of others, and honestly, it's just not a fun system once you realize that your actions really aren't affecting anything. And you'll realize this pretty quickly throughout playing the game because sometimes the news bulletins don't actually match up with what you're doing. I would sometimes fail a mission, but then go and read the story about what had just happened, and it would say that I had succeeded, or sometimes I would have bulletins appearing saying that a raven was sent in and cleaned up a mission that I never even did. So you'll realize within the first couple hours of playing this game that you're not actually affecting the world the way that FromSoftware wants you to think that you are, and the entire illusion is shattered and you realize that you're kind of just missing out on half the game. And speaking of the story, we should probably cover that, but I don't really know what to say about it. This is easily the most basic story out of the franchise so far. It almost feels like you're playing through another age, but it actually has some story to it thanks to the news bulletins. For the most part, you're just kind of going to be going from random mission to random mission, doing whatever it is that they're paying you to do, and then move on to the next one. It does set up some intrigue from the first couple missions of the game, with one of the new corporations, Navis, discovering a new resource and refusing to share it with the rest of the world or the other corporations. This sparks an all-out war between all of the corporations that we know of, and that conflict really makes up the story of the game. So if you're interested in the politics of these corporations and this world, then this story will probably be your thing, but if not, then there might as well be no story for you. And thank God for the news bulletins, because without them, I wouldn't even know what I was doing half the time. The pre-mission logs have been massively cut back in this game to pretty much just give you your objective and nothing else of interest or value, and the majority of them wouldn't even tell you what corporation or faction you were fighting against in that mission. A lot of the time, I would know what corporation I was doing the job for. For example, I might get a mission from Crest telling me to go destroy a convoy, but I wouldn't get any details about what that convoy was until after destroying it and reading the news after the fact. But getting back to the gameplay, one thing I loved in this game was the cutscenes. The quality in the cutscenes of this game is miles ahead of anything we've seen in the franchise up to this point. I mean, just look at these compared to the previous games. The animation quality, the framing, the camera shake that adds weight to everything. It's so far ahead of the previous games. And even though some of these scenes border on like over-the-top anime action, I honestly don't think that's a bad direction to take the action of the franchise in, especially considering that the entire mecha genre was originally born from manga and anime in the first place. Another weird quirk that this game has in its gameplay is that most of the radio messages mid-mission sound perfectly normal, but some of them are incredibly blown out. At first, I thought this was an emulator issue, but I booted up the game on my PS2, and sure enough, they actually just sound like this.
Main system. Engaging combat mode.
The overheating system has been a part of the franchise since Armored Core 2, but it's never really done a whole lot. In all the games up to this point, you really only would overheat from taking a lot of enemy fire at once, and when you do overheat, your armor just takes damage over time. It was always something that was best to avoid, but overheating wasn't really going to hurt you the majority of the time. But here in Nexus, they gave the system a full overhaul, and well, let's just go over it first. Using your boosters now properly contributes to your AC heat in a realistic way, meaning you're going to heat up a lot more than before, since it'll happen anytime you're using your boosters. And the gradual armor damage from overheating is also gone, replaced by your radiator actually pulling energy from your generator realistically to force cool your AC. But what this means in the context of the game actually being played is that you're going to be using your boosters a lot in the more difficult fights, especially those against other ACs, and after using your boosters and probably burning a ton of energy doing so, you're going to overheat, and your radiator is then going to pull a massive chunk of energy to cool you off, and you'll probably burn out your generator and need to wait for it to recharge. And if you couldn't tell from that description, I hate it. Like, I really hate it. I'm sure that this new version of the system is something that I could get used to, as even by the end of my time with this game, I was much more mindful of avoiding it, but I would rather just not have to. And this brings up an interesting discussion. Does the overheat mechanic really belong in these games? Something like Nexus's interpretation is what I always thought the system should have been, but now that I've experienced it firsthand, it's just horribly unfun to engage with. This is one of those situations where I have a criticism, but I don't really have a good solution other than bringing it back to the way it was in Gen 2 and 3, but even then, it's just not really a meaningful mechanic in those interpretations. So while I appreciate the attempted realism and depth that the radiators and the heat mechanic brings, I'm starting to wonder if it even has a place in Sandbox at all. And speaking of fighting other ACs, the arena does make a return here, but it's integrated in a bit of a weird way. Along with everything else in this game, they've completely overhauled how the arena and the ranking system works. Everything you do in this game will earn you Raven points from missions to arena battles, and the amount of Raven points you have will determine your rank on the leaderboard. So with this, you can't just go and climb the ladder at will the way you used to. Instead, arena battles will pop up onto your map along with other missions, and you can choose to participate in them or not from here. But this also means that fighting in the arena will cause time to progress, causing you to miss out on even more potential missions. And the overheating change made the arena really unfun to me personally, which is how you really know that they ruined it. When you've got me, the guy who has spent at least 5 minutes per video talking about the arena saying that it wasn't fun, you know that it's bad. The pilots lack a lot of personality here because they reverted to the bios just describing their build and fighting style rather than what they're like as a person, and there are only like 4 or 5 maps for the arena here. This is probably just because of the structure change and how FromSoft knew that it would lead to players spending less time on these battles. And even when it comes to the quality of these maps, every single one of them is just a large open square or circle for you to fight in, meaning they lack the more dynamic nature of arena maps from the previous games. So the map quality, along with the slower movement, the overheating changes, and the way that it takes away from the campaign just made me really not enjoy the arena in this game. And this is something that extends to both the missions and the arena battles in this game, but you can't retry any piece of content on your first playthrough once you fail. And for someone like me, this really sucks. I'm obviously a newer player to these games, so for me, part of the fun of the game is realizing where I'm making mistakes and learning and improving along the way, and there's no real way to do that when I only get one chance at every individual piece of content. I could have successfully completed every activity in the game by saving after every single mission or fight and loading that save whenever I failed something, but I try to play these games the way that they're meant to be played for these videos, and unfortunately in this sense, the way that Armored Core Nexus is meant to be played is just kind of frustrating. I do really like the changes to the Raven ranking system though, because it feels like a much more accurate reflection of my performance as a player. I was worried throughout a lot of my playthrough that I might not reach the top because I would fail missions here and there and fall behind, but I literally reached the number 1 rank after like the 3rd to last mission, so I managed to get up to number 1 just in time. It doesn't have quite that like top of the hill, Ninebreaker-esque feel to it because most of my credits came from missions, but I was still happy to see that I was at least competent enough at the game to reach that rank. Back to the campaign though, one thing that I have to give Nexus is that the mission variety is actually really good here, and while there aren't really any long-running missions like what I talked about with Silent Line, Nexus did generally go back to that bite-sized mission style that we saw all the way back in Armored Core 1, and I actually really enjoyed going back to this. I know that it's weird because I somehow love both the style where missions take 1 or 2 minutes and then you're on to the next one, and the style where missions are upwards of 10 minutes apiece and incredibly difficult. But I mean, just look at this. Like, this mission literally took me 8 seconds flat.
Main system engaging combat mode.
They're using electronic countermeasures. Don't lose sight of the helicopter.
Mission objective achieved.
There's a certain charm that these shorter missions have, and it also helps me get through longer sessions because the pace just feels a lot better. So honestly, I enjoyed having missions like this again. And using the right headpiece for your AC is more important than ever in this game. There are a lot of different things to factor in, like ECM resistance, whether or not they have biosensors to target organic beings, whether or not they have night vision provided for when you're going on a nighttime mission. It's really interesting. And in an uncharacteristically generous move from FromSoft, they tell you before missions what kind of equipment you'll need, rather than just having you guess. And I'm kind of mixed on the whole headpiece thing, because on one hand, it's interesting to tweak your build for a specific mission, but on the other, I kind of just want to make cool mechs that I designed, and not have to change something as significant to the look of that design as the headpiece. And on the topic of customization, thanks to the new control scheme, dual-wielding weapons is back and better than ever, despite a couple weird quirks. There are more weapon varieties for the left hand now in Nexus, including rifles, sniper rifles, machine guns, pretty much any weapon category you can think of for the right hand, you can also now use in the left. And thanks to the triggers and the bumpers now being freed up, firing both weapons at once feels so much more natural than pressing square and circle at the same time. Which, yes, I never mentioned it in my AC3 video, but that really was how you fired both weapons at once. Like, it could have been any other set of face buttons, you had to choose the ones that were opposite from one another. But a weird thing is that while the right hand weapon is always up and ready to fire, the left hand one rests down at your side. This is something that's completely fine until you go to fire both weapons at once. When you do, your right hand weapon will fire immediately, but you'll need to hold the fire button for your left hand and wait for your AC to raise it to the ready position and then start firing. It's not super significant, but this little delay just feels so awkward, and I hope that this gets sorted out by the next release, because I really love dual-wielding machine guns in this game. Also, not every right-hand weapon is available for the left hand, which is the same as it was in the Gen 3 games, but there were a lot of weapons that I would have loved to just buy 2 of them and run akimbo that I simply couldn't. It's not a big deal, but it's just something I thought I would bring up. Speaking of weird quirks, most missions in Nexus pay so much in advance that even if you fail, you still profit. This ends up making the economy kind of a joke because it's effectively impossible to go into debt or even just to lose money at all in this game. I genuinely think that the economy is one of the most important things for these games to get right, because even though you'll normally have plenty of extra credits by the end, the journey there will be completely different depending on how tight or loose the economy is. And the economy here is the loosest that Armored Core has ever seen. And then there's this game's weirdest quirk of all. The story actually gets really good for the last 3 missions. So genuinely, this game has little to no story until it suddenly becomes amazing for like the last 15 minutes of the game. It starts with you being sent in to eliminate the #1 ranked AC, Genobi. Throughout this fight with him, he's constantly rambling about how power is all that matters now, and how the relics of the past will cause human arrogance to destroy society. Then, in the next mission, you're sent in to destroy another massive MT before it's released, and this is about the point that you put together that new technology that Navis discovered way back at the beginning is actually some ancient technology allowing them to build these giant weapons. And finally, for the last mission, we're sent to destroy a whole facility of equipment before it can be activated, and while we're doing this, we get an appearance from an old friend.
Destroy.
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 Is it really dumb that 9-Ball is here despite the timeline getting rebooted 2 games ago? Yeah. Does he have a really cool redesign, and is it fun to fight him again? Also, yeah. After defeating 9-Ball, we find out that we're too late and a horde of unmanned drones get released and flood out to the surface of the facility. And here we get this pretty incredible final stand.
Enemy targets approaching. It may be too late. But we must stand and fight. It's our way.
And while it's not ever said or shown outright, in my mind, it's pretty safe to assume that our character dies during this final stand. And it may not have that big final boss fight that I've come to expect from the franchise, but the ending was just so unique and so potent that I actually loved this. Overall, Nexus is a really weird game in the series. It overhauls just about every core system from the franchise up to this point, and the majority of those changes are not for the better. If I had to say what I think the largest downgrade was, the number one thing that I would want them to go back on, I would say the new map system has to be it for me. While I appreciate what they're going for, missing so many missions and arena matches because of the new map system just isn't very fun, especially when it has absolutely no impact on the outcome of the game. Yet somehow, I would be lying if I said the game as a whole wasn't a lot of fun to play through. And actually, it's the game that I played through the fastest since Master of Arena a few videos back, because I completed Nexus from front to back in about a day and a half. So while a lot of systems were downgraded, the bite-sized missions, the new control scheme, and the fact that the customization is pretty much just Gen 3 with dual wielding being expanded makes for a really fun Armored Core game, even if it's not the best Armored Core game. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Armored Core Nexus a 7.3. But what do you guys think? Those of you that have played the game, those of you learning about it for the first time, let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like, a comment, a subscription, anything to let me and the algorithm know that you did enjoy. It helps me out a lot, so I really appreciate it. And if you didn't know already, I stream almost every day right here on the channel, and recently we've been playing through all sorts of new stuff like Armored Core 6, Starfield, and Baldur's Gate 3, so feel free to stop by sometime and say hi. And hey, if you enjoyed this video and you haven't seen them already, then you'll definitely enjoy the rest of my Armored Core videos, so I'll have them linked right here on screen.